We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hi everyone, welcome back to, or not really welcome back, welcome to this new episode, ArchaeoAnimals. I'm Alex Patrick, and with me as always,
Simona Falanga.
And we are once again back in our mini-series we've been doing for the past couple episodes, Time Warped, which is still a great title if you ask me. This is kind of a tragic episode for Simona as we are post-Roman.
They've gone. They've all gone.
They've left.
They've all gone.
How are you feeling, Simona, now that we did your big episode and we're beyond the Romans now?
I feel I can just lie down and let you take it away.
No, that's fine. I mean, we were actually talking about it right before we started recording, and I figured we should probably talk about it on the episode. But post-Roman is a very tricky, weird word, isn't it?
Yes, because it sits in between. It's not quite the medieval period. I believe formerly was referred to as the Dark Ages. Please don't do that.
No, don't use that.
Don't do that. I believe in recent years, the generally accepted term is just the post-Roman period. At the same time, for such a short time period, you can break it up into I guess, two sub-periods, because you have the time right after the Romans, and then we'll get more into it later, but the Saxon population organizing into kingdoms and the Scandinavian populations coming in. So you have the Anglo-Scandinavian period, which is similar, but also quite different from the earlier part of the post-Roman period. So yes, no, it's a roller coaster of fun, but very, very interesting archaeology.
Yeah, there's just a lot happening, to be completely honest. So, looking back, well, I mean, obviously we are looking back, we're archaeologists. Looking back at kind of, the idea of it being post-Roman as a period, there's enough happening to kind of fill, say, a podcast episode. And that's exactly what we'll be doing. So, more or less, when we say post-Roman period, we mean everything from the Romans leaving Britannia and the Norman conquest of 1066.
Well, at least in this part of the world. Because, of course, the start of the medieval period changes depending on which part of the world you're in. Even within the same continent, in Italy, for example, I believe that the medieval period officially begins with the fall of the Roman Empire, or the Western Roman Empire, which is, I'm going to feel so bad if I'm wrong, 476.
I'm going to trust you. I trust you with my life.
BC, AD, BC.
It's very confusing, folks. You got all these different letters coming at you. We got all these different groups. We're post, we're pre, I'm in the middle. I mean, we could clearly have done a whole podcast just on terminology and how confusing it can be.
I mean, we could do one on animal bone terminology.
Yeah, we probably could.
It's just about how to use an audio medium to describe the actual term. Well, I guess we can use a very technical term, so the distal epiphysis of metapodials, which are usually referred to as the roly bits.
Roly bits. Very, very concise terminology here at ArchaeoAnimals. But yeah, I mean, as we were just saying, one of the complications with this period is there's a lot of different groups happening now. We're not necessarily looking at, not that we were ever kind of looking at one homogenous group when we're talking about these time periods. But at this point, there's a lot going on because obviously the Romans are leaving Britain. We have this power vacuum that's left. And obviously we're now seeing different groups kind of vie for that power. just something I'm actually working on right now is writing about the Pictish up in Scotland, who are one of those, at least in the part of Scotland that I work in, those are one of the groups, the main groups that are fighting, these smaller Iron Age groups in particular at the time. So it's definitely very interesting for archaeologists to have to go through all this, specifically where we're talking about, we see Northwestern European populations like the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, they're all moving to the British Isles, settling largely in the east of England, and they're pushing the Britons westwards. And obviously that is very interesting to look at in the archaeological record.
Yeah, absolutely. And you do see, of course, shifts in time, because these are, we're going to call them for ease, Saxon populations. You'll see them convert to Christianity, and they would organize themselves into kingdoms. And that's where the Scandinavians arrive, just to make it all a bit more fun, as of the 8th century. So from there on, usually the period gets referred to as the Anglo-Scandinavian. Because you have Scandinavian populations coming in the form of organized raids to begin with. Later also as settlers, with some organized raiding here and there as well. Culminating in 1066 with the biggest raid of them all. The Normans come over and they just conquer Britain.
Just flatten it.
The Normans are kind of sort of descending from Scandinavians anyway.
I mean, that's the thing, I feel like, because that obviously you could technically kind of broad strokes, categorize these groups, but realistically, you do have a lot of splintered groups kind of infighting and developing their own kind of communities at this time, which again is very complicated for archaeologists who obviously, if it was up to all of us to sort out the chronology of things, it would be very cut and dry, but that's not real life, is it? Especially when you have people conquering other people.
Yeah, absolutely, because in terms of sort of the conquering populations, while, there were very sort of distinct groups, in very, very broad strokes, we're still talking about sort of Northern European populations. So in a way, a lot of the material culture is very similar. Initially, before sort of the Saxon, again in inverted commas, convert to Christianity, the pantheon is very similar to that of Scandinavian populations. So, they are very similar groups, but also different. And in the archaeological record, it's not always as easy to distinguish between the various groups, again, because on paper they are so similar.
And obviously you also have to account for trade happening, even if they're necessarily vying for space and for power. There are still, obviously, you have that the trade going between the two. So you'll see some artifacts that you might categorize as, say, Saxon in places which aren't necessarily Saxon, and so on. It's a hodgepodge of things, really. And I wonder if this more so than any other period. Do you know what I mean?
I guess, but also in a ways because we have a bit more to go by.
True. Yeah, that's obviously a huge thing. Although, technically, it can be considered prehistoric.
That's one of the interesting things about it. At least, up until the 8th century, it is sort of reverting back to prehistory. And of course, that's strictly in a sense that there is a lack of written record that was left behind. So in a way, it once becomes sort of very Iron Age-like in the way, okay, what's going on here?
Yeah, it is interesting, especially because, I know we kind of had this conversation in the earlier episodes, but prehistory as a term itself is very fluctuating, isn't necessarily cut and dry. My PhD thesis is technically called Later Prehistoric Rituals and Rites, but I go all the way up until the post-medieval. But, you could probably claim 90% of what I do is prehistory. But, that also brings us into the kind of, word of caution we've been doing in every episode, but maybe this episode even more so than the other ones. It's kind of worth saying again, these are all conventional terms to identify a time period. And frankly, a lot of this warning can also be applied to the names of groups and cultures, because obviously it isn't necessarily as cut and dry as we'd like it to be, or as what we're probably kind of conveying to you.
Yeah. And also, like, the important thing as well is that we've, in a way, decided to call these populations the Saxons, the Angles, and the Jutes. Not necessarily maybe what they call themselves or what they wanted to be called.
No, not really. I mean, to be honest, especially as someone, I mean, I guess you have a similar case as people who are not from Britain. I feel like it's almost an increased amount of confusion, because obviously, at least in America, we did not learn any of this stuff. So even though I've been, practicing archaeology here in the UK for almost 10 years, like closer to 6, I still can get very confused at this period.
It's a lot of terms, but yes, as we said, it's all quite arbitrary and is for ease of to identify a population or a time period. Of course, we've said in the 6th century, sort of what is known as sort of the migration period, we see all these northwestern Germanic, largely populations coming in, but it's not like, oh, it's a 6th century, everyone here is Saxon. And then at one point, sort of later on, sort of in the 7th, 8th century, be like, oh, we're all Christian now, because these would have been very gradual events. And indeed, the population that I keep referring to as Saxons were actually several populations, as you said earlier, just mainly, again, Northwestern European. But again, for ease, we do tend to say Saxon when we talk about the time period.
Similar to that, we also have, the Vikings being kind of a catch-all word for the Scandinavian populations that are coming across, because obviously it would be kind of annoying to keep saying Scandinavian seafaring groups over and over and over again.
Yeah. So, well, not technically correct. We might slip a few Viking here and there.
It's interesting as well, because the other thing that I've always kind of seen, especially when I was doing my undergraduate, I was considering going into what is referred to as Viking Age archaeology, is, a lot of times they're also just kind of referred to as the Norse. And it's like, well, kind of, sort of.
If they were from Norway, then yes.
Yeah, some of them were. So it was. But I remember doing a lot of research and finding a lot of papers that are just straight referring to all Scandinavian populations that were coming across as the Norse. And it is interesting to kind of see the ways we ultimately end up creating these catch-all terms. And, I think this whole series is a great kind of example of how we do that and how it both helps and hurts archaeology and history in general.
Yeah, because I guess maybe, in the public imagination, maybe Norwegian is the first one that comes to mind for reasons.
Yeah.
Even though I think a lot of the groups that were in Britain, at least, I'm pretty sure they were Danish, a fair few of them, but also Norwegian, and probably some Swedish in there. Why not?
Just all of them. But yeah, I mean, it is just something that is useful in the long run, because at the end of the day, we are working with huge amounts of basically data. And I know we kind of talked about this when we were doing our later prehistoric episode, but even as these periods get smaller, it is still a massive amount of time, amount of events that are occurring that we're kind of just smushing down into a single period.
You said we also have the added difficulty that up until, I guess, the time where the Honourable Bede came along with his ecclesiastical history of the English people, we have no written record.
Is Bede going to be a new character in our show?
Be there with Pliny, just Pliny Bede.
Pliny and, well, I can't say the name of that beetle. You have to say it.
Sitophilus granarius.
Yeah, I'm never going to say that, but...
And then she finds out she's mispronounced it all these episodes.
I trust you with this, but I think we're making a small kind of team, like our own time team, but it's just these characters.
With historical figures that like to write about stuff?
You mean 2 historical figures and then 1 grain weevil?
Dressed as a Roman general.
I can't imagine any time team being worse.
Hey, I'm seeing it. The animated series,
Ugh.
like autoconclusive episodes. Throw some paranormal in there, and there's, I don't know, like some creature just rising, some curse, and then, you know, you have Bede Bliney and Sitophilus Granarius.
Well, I mean, you have a bit of ritual every episode. Each episode takes place in a different time period, which gets a little confusing after a while. Yeah, I think we've got a series there.
It could be like Quantum Leap, where it doesn't really matter, like, if it's a different time period. If you work it into the narrative, you know, they could be like just time traveling. I don't know. What would they actually be doing, though?
Overarching storyline.
We need to work on this, but probably outside the show.
Sitophilus Granarius used to be an actual, like, a human Roman general, and then because of a curse, he got turned into a beetle. So they need to find clues in various time periods so he could have his human form back.
That's karma, you see.
Yeah, I think Scott Bakula would do it too. If anyone knows Scott Bakula who's listening to this podcast, please let us get in contact with him. We have a great idea for him to do.
If not, a comic strip will do.
Yeah, we can also do a comic strip. But we need to have Scott Bakula's likeness if we're going to do a whole Quantum Leap thing. Simona, do you even know who Scott Bakula is?
No.
Okay, I'll tell you about it during the break.
Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code ANIMALS. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and look for the link in the show notes to this episode.
And we're back on this episode of ArchaeoAnimals. Again, we're carrying on with our Time Warped mini-series covering the post-Roman period. For those who missed the earlier bit, by post-Roman, we mean everything sort of from the Romans leaving Britain to the Norman conquest of 1066. Now I guess we'll talk some more about the actual animal bones, since we're a zooarchaeology podcast.
Yeah, I realized that while we were doing the first part. Just noticed, I was like, oh, we never specifically mentioned that this is a zooarchaeology podcast that is talking about the zooarchaeology of the post-Roman period, not necessarily just the fact that terminology is weird and that the post-Roman period is very confusing. There were animals. Yes, there were animals first, and then they became bones.
Yeah, but I feel like that for this mini-series, you do kind of need to devote a section talking more about the time period, because we have a very varied audience, some from within the profession and some who aren't.
Yeah, you need that context, I think, especially because obviously the main theme we've got going with this miniseries is how zooarchaeology changes from period to period. And obviously, sometimes it's a little bit different. Sometimes it's not necessarily different at all. But, you know, we have these trends that we can see through these periods. And that's one of the tools that helps us as archaeologists in terms of figuring out what's happening. And I mean, the post-Roman period's kind of interesting in a way that it's kind of not interesting when it comes to zooarchaeology. I mean, to be fair, the Roman period, you have a lot to talk about with regards to, you know, introductions. The Romans are introducing species left and right, and then they kind of leave, and then those animals are just kind of left here, huh?
Fend for yourselves.
Bye.
We're done here.
There's one guy who is like, are we taking the fallow deer with us when we go back? And they're like, no, leave them. Leave them. We don't have room.
You'll be a reminder of what they lost.
What about the rabbits? Do we take the rabbits back? No.
They can have them.
This is what happens. As two archaeologists, this is our professional opinion. This is literally what happened. Again, there's some things that don't necessarily change, and I feel like in a lot of ways that's kind of just, you know, the crafts and industries that are here. We don't necessarily see huge changes, because obviously in the earlier periods, you're obviously seeing huge changes in industry because of the development of certain technologies and certain advances in how they approach certain craftsmanship.
Yeah, the crafts and industries would have been largely the same. Of course, the way these were carried out would have shifted slightly because, you know, when we talk about industries, you would have been the same, you know, like during this period, people were weaving. But guess what? So they were in the Roman period and the Iron Age period. Of course, things will change, such as, I don't know, the shape of the loom weights. In the Iron Age, they like them a bit more triangular. The Saxons, they're all about donuts. So what's a donut? I don't know. Spoiler.
You know what? I can appreciate that. I, too, am mostly into donuts and donut-shaped things. Mostly donuts, again.
And again, yeah, metalworking. Again, they did that before. And again, like bone working, antler working, again, we see that across all time periods. But of course, what gets produced changes somewhat. So one bit of bone working that I guess becomes especially prevalent in the Saxon, and especially as the Scandinavians come along, the production of bone combs.
Yes.
So you get from the more simple ones where you just get your bone plate and you carve your teeth into it, to the, I believe they're called composite ones, where you'd have sort of two bars made out of bone, and then the teeth would actually be plates. So it'd be like, well, not one tooth at a time, it'd be like a chunk of teeth on a singular plate that will be slotted onto those like two sort of rectangular plates and secured with rivets. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, mainly being due to the fact that, yes, bones are expensive. Well, combs made out of bone and more precious material like, you know, whale ivory or antler, they're expensive to make. So, of course, if you snap a tooth, what then? You got to chuck the whole thing? Or you could just replace the plate.
Yeah, and I think especially when we're talking about bone working, I mean, I think this is the case across most of the crafts and industries, but I think we're starting to see more intricacy as obviously the technology gets better, the material gets better, they're able to source material out elsewhere. These trade routes get a bit larger, a bit more out there. You're able to create more intricate, and this specifically thinking about Saxon type or Viking type, quote unquote Viking type of artifacts. You get very intricate, especially with the bone combs. I've seen so many really intricate combs
designs. Yeah, and I think, sorry, autocorrection. I just realised that I said whale ivory, which I'm not sure. I just ivory. I meant ivory.
Didn't even notice.
Did I say that? Just ivory. But now that I'm thinking about it, I'm not sure whether there's actually evidence of ivory being used in. There probably is.
I mean, there is. I'm not necessarily sure in Britain specific. I know, however, we do see that in parts of Scotland, obviously up north, because, closer to where the resources would be. But this is going to hurt my brain now trying to think about it. But
probably Scandinavia, they were trading with everyone. So
that's true. Yeah. I mean, again, that's the other thing. It's something we obviously saw in the last period we covered. But, you're seeing this still kind of seeing that prevalence, not really prevalence, but like the appearance of quote unquote exotic materials that wouldn't necessarily be, local. And that is obviously adding to that more intricate material culture that we have in this period. And I promise there are animals. I mean, we were talking about bone, but as even if, these crafts and industries are somewhat the same as they were from the last period, we are seeing some change in animal husbandry.
I guess for me anyway, sort of like what's less interesting about Roman zooarchaeology is how everything is sort of very specialized and systemic and organized.
Yeah.
So like anything involving food production. So it would have revolved around set markets and an infrastructure which has then just ceased to exist as the Romans left.
Yeah.
But of course, that doesn't mean that it all sort of changes, like it gets turned upside down, because like you do see continuity. Because, of course, you would have been sort of like the infrastructure would have been linked again to the more Romanized settlements, which, they would have collapsed as the Romans left. But, of course, we're forgetting about many, many, many native settlements around the British Isles that would have pretty much just carried on as they did before.
Yeah.
Some of these people probably been the same that would have kept doing the same thing even when the Romans were about. They're like, oh, so there's Romans here. Yeah, okay, cool, fair enough. I'll just go, like plough my field. So in a way, like we do see continuity, Romano-British patterns being perpetrated as well as late Iron Age patterns in some instances. And in a way, I guess also because the sort of the prehistoric nature of this period, it does almost seems like you're reverting to the Iron Age in a way. Like I know, like strictly non-animal bone related with like pottery production, because we go back. We had like some of the very sort of specialized Roman kilns and the variety of vessels that were produced, and then sort of when they left, it sort of went back to sort of clamped kiln firing of very sort of utilitarian looking vessels. I mean, you do see some nicer ones as well. And as time goes by, you do tend to see sort of better fired material. But yeah, you do see sort of that reverting, not necessarily back, but just like, who cares about the fancy molded bit of Samian? I'm just going to like do me a coil pot.
Yeah, I mean, there's something very interesting. And again, I'm mostly speaking from Scotland because that's where I mostly do my research. But there is something very interesting and strange happening, especially kind of from between that like late Iron Age, like the very end of the Iron Age, the Roman Iron Age particularly, into this post-Roman period where you're kind of seeing a bit of a, not even like reminiscing, but like a return to a lot of Iron Age sites in particular. So like in Scotland, you see a lot of reuse of Iron Age sites or even, late Bronze Age, early Bronze Age sites. And, I think a lot of it has to do with this change in social structure and change in what's happening, socially and culturally, in that, this is the way people kind of returned. It's almost a return to your roots type of situation, I feel like, where how best to strengthen these community bonds, especially when, all this other nonsense is happening around you, and then to return to the kind of early Iron Age type of, cultural traditions and things like that. So I think that it must be some of that in terms of, it is like we said at the beginning, it is a power vacuum happening, and political upheaval and social upheaval is going to have a knockdown effect and really, hit even, say, these, native settlements that aren't necessarily as affected as some other settlements. So yeah, it's not, and it's also not like the Romans took everything with them when they left. Obviously, as you were just saying, things are still slightly Romanized, and also we still have the kind of material culture which is being put to use in one way or the other. You start seeing like the Roman coin hoards, redeposition of Roman pottery sherds. It's a whole mess.
I think there's a whole series of PhDs on reusing of like Roman material culture by the Saxons.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm kind of going through it now, so...
Because I guess, 13 minutes into it, what about the animals that were recovered? I guess to address the earlier points, I mean, the Romans probably did leave the rabbits and they did leave the fallow deer, although I think the fallow deer is extremely common, if not rare, during this time.
Yeah, maybe.
Because I think the general consensus now seems to be that, of course, we have the fallow deer that we have in the country, in the British Isles today, do not descend from the ones that the Romans introduced. So it is presumed that the Romans introduced the fallow deer, and then it sort of died out as they left, and was then reintroduced a second time by the Normans.
Just love that fallow deer. Can't blame them.
Yeah, just like the Normans as well. I thought that this is what we hunt in France. So fallow deer. But we have roe deer and red deer. No good. Fallow deer. Could be worse.
Yeah.
But in terms of main domesticates, we do tend to largely see mixed economies.
Yeah.
Which, again, it is true for a lot. I mean, it gets a bit more specialised in the Roman period, but it does tend to be sort of pretty much the same across the board. The animals will tend to be multifunctional. So, like, sheep would be kept for dairy, they'll be kept for meat and for their wool. Cattle will be kept for both milk and meat. And, of course, but mixed economies meaning sort of herding and agriculture, sort of keeping livestock and raising crop sort of at the same time. So we do tend to see that in the first instance, at least. So what's interesting about sort of this time period is that we do see some more introductions to the British Isles. Mm-hmm. Now, like, they're not as, I guess, as fancy as the Roman introductions, because they don't tend to be different species altogether, but more like different breeds of domesticates, which the Roman also did, but who's keeping scores? So
clearly our podcast.
Like the Vikings in particular introduced several short-tailed sheep breeds whose descendants you actually still see in Britain today. And in a way, they've been here so long that they're now considered native British breeds. I mean, good examples of that would be like the various Hebridean breeds, as well as I'm not going to pronounce this properly, the Manx Luden.
Is that how you pronounce that?
Loudon? Luden?
I wouldn't even have tried that. So more power to you.
But for those of you who have never seen them, they look quite funky because they have sort of multiple horns. So they'll have some will have, none. Some will have just the one. I've seen that as well. But usually it'll be like between 4 and 6 horns. They're quite cool. I think they've got a small flock at Butser Ancient Farm.
They do, yeah.
Which, for those of you who don't know, it's an experimental archaeology farm in the south of Britain, which also, of course, keep ancient breeds, I should expect. So, yeah, you can see some of those there. And then there's another interesting breed that is believed to have been introduced by Viking settlers, though not in this country. I thought I'd spice it up a bit. Ooh. It's actually an introduction to Iceland, and that's the Icelandic leader sheep.
That's such a good name. Oh, wow.
And apparently the leader sheep, and it's in the name, we'll get to that, for the longest time it was actually considered a subspecies because of how clever it is.
Wow.
So now while, its meat utility, I mean, it's nothing out of the ordinary. I mean, it's not brilliant, but it's okay, I guess. But this sheep was mainly kept because it's a very intelligent breed, and you would be kept amongst a flock, not necessarily the same breed or other breed of sheep, because of its ability to protect the flock and even the shepherd himself at times. So especially sort of facing extreme weather conditions, which I suppose you would get in Iceland, where it has been known to lead both sheep and shepherds to safety.
Huh. Okay.
So, because that's not as needed anymore, I guess, that ability to protect flock and shepherd, because of course we know we have developed the technology to sort of withstand the weather, and you don't have to be out in all seasons. And
well, not all of us, to be fair.
in this part of the world. And of course, there's only so much you need to guard your flock in this country, because we've obliterated all the predators that were here once. So,
and pigs are still high status because they're so annoying to keep. And I think that's it for that. So I think we'll take a break, and then we will get to the case studies. Woo!
You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to arcpodnet.com/shop for a link. That's arcpodnet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show.
And we are back with ArchaeoAnimals. We are talking about the zooarchaeology of the post-Roman period as part of our larger Time Warped mini-series. I almost forgot the name of the mini-series, which would be wild because it's just Time Warped.
And you came up with it.
I know, that's really sad. But more importantly, it's our case studies. Again, our self-identified best part of the podcast. No one's called us out on it, so I'm going to keep saying that.
Absence of evidence is an evidence of absence.
Yeah, it's true. We're actually going to start kind of close to where I am now with Coppergate, York, which surprisingly, despite living not that far away from York itself, I've never actually been to the Jorvik Center.
Yeah, I've only been there once.
So I haven't really seen any of this.
I've been there the once. Unfortunately, I think they've been struggling with floods for quite a few times.
Yeah. I should probably go at some point. It's really not that far from me. But yeah, I think when I first moved here, it got hit with floods pretty badly and was closed for a bit. But it's, from what I've heard, sounds really cool. So if you're in the area, if you can eventually travel safely, definitely go visit. But it's not necessarily the Jorvik Center we're talking about for this case study. It's a site from York that I believe the Jorvik Center has on display, which is Coppergate. And it was excavated in 1972, and it's mostly Viking Age material. And it's most specifically known for how well preserved the material is. It's a rare thing for a lot of archaeological sites. We actually get to see and still have textiles and timber, as well as very, minuscule insect remains and plant remains and animal remains. So basically a environmental archaeologist's dream right there. And the excavation went on from 1976 to 1981. And as I said, you can see a lot of this material at the Jorvik Viking Center. And obviously, most of the zooarchaeology that we're kind of going to talk about in this little section is your midden material, which I feel like we don't talk much about midden material on this podcast.
No, because it's something like, I don't know, by midden material, do we mean sort of waste that is built up, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it is mostly food waste that we're talking about here. 5 tons of faunal bones, which honestly gives me an anxiety attack to think about.
Imagine quantifying that.
No, that's my nightmare. I know I said that this place is an environmental archaeologist's dream, but actually it's a zooarchaeologist's nightmare, and I'm going to start having recurring nightmares about being sat down in a lab and they just wheel over 5 tons of animal bone and they say, do this, and then I cry.
Gonna need some bigger scales.
Oh gosh.
But yeah, no, I think midden, we don't talk about them as much, because I think you tend to find them more in urban sites as opposed to rural, not because they wouldn't have had middens, but because the way the archaeology is carried out in urban, you sort of have all these sort of structures and floor surfaces pretty much on top of each other.
Yeah.
So you'll be able, as you go down, to sort of find the positive feature of the midden. But then because of the way it's done in rural, where you strip down the topsoil and the subsoil, so then if there would have been a midden, you would have been sort of into what is now our topsoil and subsoil, and it would have probably been ploughed away a long time ago.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I only just realized it as, we're obviously doing this section. Obviously, we are a podcast. We are allegedly both entertaining and educating, edutainment, as they say. And, we do tend to pick out, especially when we do our case studies, the more, as glamorous as you get into archaeology. And obviously midden material is very important, but also maybe not necessarily the most glamorous thing as, say, the pet cemeteries in ancient Egypt or whatever.
No, but it all adds up to the evidence, because ultimately the rubbish will tell you more about the people.
Yeah, true. I mean, obviously you can't, archaeology, the mundane, you absolutely need it. Just, I guess I don't know how it translates to trying to entertain the masses. And speaking of entertaining the masses, there also seems to be a lot of oyster shells, which I don't know about you, I can't really talk about because I don't really do that.
I mean, oyster shells are very popular across the board. You do see them in amount in the Roman period. You do kind of see them beforehand as well. They're just a cheap and food source that is fairly easy to get hold of.
Yeah.
I'm not too knowledgeable on it, but I'm sure you can tell. So you do see oyster shells, also mussels, and you can tell sort of if they're sort of marine or sea or freshwater.
Yes, you can.
So then that you can gain inference on, how, if they've traded them or if it was a local resource, how they've gone about acquiring it.
Yeah, there's a whole, this is not to dismiss. I know a couple of colleagues who specifically do shell work, and it is incredible how much material you can get out of shells, which is something that I would ignore as a zooarchaeologist with very little patience. I mean, you do see it a lot, especially when you're, again, working with middens. But obviously, it's not just about oyster shells here at
Yes,
Coppergate.
we are now the oyster shell podcast.
No, this is my nightmare.
But usually in archaeological sites, you'll get just two different types. There's really two main types you need to distinguish between. It's okay. It's okay.
I'm okay now. Maybe then we can talk about more craftsmanship stuff, which is slightly more interesting. Again, no offense to our shell specialists.
Just alienating everyone. First it's the fish, now it's shell specialists.
I don't mean to do it. I can't, my brain isn't formed enough to figure out how to do any of that stuff. So I'm jealous, really. But this is something I can do, and that's worked animal remains. And luckily, Coppergate has a lot of really interesting stuff. So one of the more notable artifacts that were found is a gaming board, which had pieces made from walrus ivory, something that we talked about and couldn't remember.
Yeah, no,
it was in our notes.
Whale ivory.
Not whale. So it's likely imported from Scandinavia, or it's scavenged from washed up walrus, or technically could be whale.
Do you get ivory from whale?
I believe you can from teethies.
Cool. Okay, so I wasn't completely wrong earlier. That's fine.
No, I don't think so, unless I'm wrong, which is very possible. Anyway, we also had calf leather sheaths for swords, which, again, like we were talking about earlier in the episode, you get that very intricate carving and decoration, or no, just intricate decoration here. You do get intricate carving, however, in the antler combs that they found, which, again, ties into what we were talking about in the beginning with regards to, antler combs have always been kind of made, but now they're being made slightly nicer. And I think my favorite find is the ice skates, which were made from horse and cattle bones, which were polished to be used as the blade, which I know is something you kind of find commonly in Scandinavian settlements from around this time. They're just so cool.
That's interesting now, because I've seen at a museum, I'm forgetting where, ice skates made out of horse bones that were actually post-medieval.
Oh, that is interesting.
I can't remember what century, but it was the metapodials.
Mm.
It was horse metapodials, and
that makes sense.
On the display, they interpreted them as ice skates. So I guess that's sort of carried on. That's cool.
Yeah, I mean, I mostly associate it with Viking Age, because again, I used to do Viking Age archaeology, and this is something you also see in later on in settlements in Iceland, these kind of really interesting animal bone ice skates, and it's really cool to see that they've made it as far as York. It's a really interesting site because these are very intricate worked items that are ultimately actually not as, unusual. They're just very mundane items that are made of animal bone and remains, which are cool.
Well, that's what I like. The archaeology of the mundane.
Yeah. I do like that. I mean, listen, we love ritual at this podcast, but sometimes you just kind of want to sit back, get cozy, and enjoy some archaeology of the mundane.
Yeah, ritual is just scary and confusing.
I mean, a lot of archaeology is scary and confusing.
Even a horse ice skate?
I mean, maybe. I don't know. But speaking of more cozy, mundane, we should probably go to our next case study, which is, I mean, I guess it's probably cozy. It's a domestic site, settlement.
Second case study is about West Stow.
Yes.
I mean, they have reconstructed some of the buildings, which I'm told are quite cozy when you get a fire going, in the hearth in the middle. So, yeah, let's explore the cozy site of West Stow. Also known as one of the most important early Saxon settlements to be excavated in Britain. And what was so good about it is like the site was nearly intact and there were no later phases of occupation afterwards. So in a way, because usually, so if you get, like an Iron Age settlement and a Roman on top of it, like the Roman will normally just trash whatever's underneath.
Yeah.
And you'll cut through all the old Iron Age features. And of course, you get that a lot in urban archaeology where everything is just trashing everything just on top of each other. But not West Stow. Once the Saxons, inverted commas, left, that was that. There was no later occupation following sort of that period. The site, I mean, it was full of buildings because they've recovered a total of 70 SFBs and 7 halls. Now, SFB, I can never remember 100% what it stands for, is if it's sunken feature building or sunken floor building, or that's usually what they're known as in this country, although they do have, I think the first were identified in Germany, so there is sort of a German name for them, which I cannot pronounce, so I'm not going to pretend. But they were sort of your box standard sort of Saxon dwelling, which is usually a circular feature, a depression in the ground. So it's almost like a sort of fairly sort of wide and shallow pit, except it's not a pit. It would have been part of the Saxon dwelling. And 7 halls. So, as I said before, some of the buildings have since been reconstructed and you can actually visit them, as West Stow is now an experimental archaeology farm, much like Butzer, which we've described in the earlier settlement. Not unlike Coppergate, you do find a fair bit of bone and antler working at West Stow. So specifically made of antler, they have recovered some very sort of beautifully preserved combs. Of course, you get evidence for your weaving, so that'll probably be in the form of previously mentioned donut-shaped loom weights, and you do get pottery production as well. Okay, not animal bone related. So they were producing pottery at West Stow, and they've actually recovered sort of a rare antler pottery stamp.
Wow.
Which is quite cool.
Yeah. I mean, I've literally never heard of that prior to doing this episode.
No, for those who have not heard of pottery stamps before, I mean, you do tend to see them mostly in the Roman period, where sort of a potter would normally, we would have their own stamp with which they'd be marking their own work. You see that with potters today.
Yeah, of course. But not antler.
Made out of antler, I'm not sure what they're normally made of, the stamps, in all fairness. So I just know how useful they can be, especially in the Roman period, because I saw they tend to be we have sort of developed almost like a database, for the lack of a better word, of all the various sort of stamps and who they pertain to. So it's easy to sort of easy. You can sort of geographically locate sort of where the pot has been made, looking at the stamp. So they're quite useful in that sense. Yeah, West Stow has an antler one.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I knew kind of about the idea of pottery stamps. I just never really thought of, obviously, you could use something like antler or some kind of animal product to make a pottery stamp. But yeah, no, that's really cool.
So I've not seen photos of the actual artifact, but I mean, bone and antler working is difficult on a good day. But trying to carve a pottery stamp on a piece of antler, of course, it'd have to be something quite small.
Yes.
To be able to sort of stamp the base of a pot. So try to have any sort of pattern or writing just carved into antler like that. How many times did you have to soak that? try and get that in. There's a painstaking work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, again, it's a nice kind of bookend, this, at least using this site as a case study, is a nice bookend to kind of what we've been talking about this whole episode, which is, overall, we are seeing, very kind of the mastery of certain crafts, and they're becoming more intricate. And even if they're necessarily not changing much in terms of what they're doing, they're finding new ways to kind of create this very intricate work that's going to continue on to our, the medieval period. Stow is a great example of that with the antler stamps.
I guess just briefly about the bulk animal bone that was recovered.
The other stuff.
I mean, they've had 180,000 animal bones.
That's so many.
Yes, imagine how many of those are small fragments, unidentified, small to medium mammal. But it does give us a nice picture of early Saxon animal husbandry and industry, to be fair. I mean, as a general trend, once the farm has sort of been properly established, we see a decrease in the remains of pig and an increase in the numbers of cattle and sheep.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I get to be fair, like pigs are not the most economical thing to keep. Because in a way, you can feed it just about anything, or I guess you could back in the day. It only gives you meat, and it doesn't really give you anything else up until the point you butcher it. So you're just like feeding it and feeding it and feeding it and feeding it. Yeah.
So that's a thing that remains consistent. Regardless of change, the pig remains.
The pig will eat all of your food.
Yeah, big mood. And I think that's a good way to end this episode. As always, you can find us at ArchaeoAnimals on Twitter. You can also find us on Facebook. We are also on the Archaeology Podcast Network website. If you want to share our stuff to other people, recommend us to loads of adoring fans or whatever.
Yeah, if you want to make that comic strip about the adventures of Bede, Pliny, and Sitophilus Granarius.
Yeah, and if you're Scott Bakula and you want to contact us, we can talk about that, that TV series, let us know. And as always, this has been Alex Fitzpatrick.
And Simona Falanga.
See ya next time. Bye.
Thank you for listening to ArchaeoAnimals. Please subscribe and rate the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. You can find us on Twitter at ArchaeoAnimals. Also, the views expressed on the podcast are those of ourselves, the hosts and guests, and do not necessarily represent those of our institution, employers, and the Archaeology Podcast Network. Thanks for listening.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV Traveling America, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Laura Johnson and Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.